Hi, everyone. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Jay Bailey. Jay is an American born writer who now lives in Israel with his family, and he's been living here since 1995. And Jay is the author of a really interesting historical novel, and it is called The Blood of Birds. And it's a thriller historical fiction novel about the era of King David. So we are going to speak with Jay today about his background, his inspiration, and he's going to tell us more about his book. So just a little bit more about Jay. His work blends biblical history with fast-paced plotting. And Jay is a big-time fan of historical fiction, biblical archaeology, the history and culture and geography of both modern and ancient Israel. And he also is a licensed tour guide, and he's really great at storytelling. So we're going to hear more from Jay today, and thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure to be here with you, Udi.
So Jay, can you just maybe just give us a little bit of background about yourself? Where are you from? And tell us a bit more about who you are.
Okay. Originally from Los Angeles, been here in Israel since 1995. And I've always basically been fascinated by, the balance between biblical texts and the stuff we know. Call it, the science, the archaeology, the history, the material that, especially over the last few decades, has been collected that helps elucidate a lot of biblical texts. It started back when I was in college. I took a class in biblical archaeology, and just with Harvey Sober, who was also he was a professor there.
Where was that? Where did you
This
go
was
to
at
college?
Yeshiva University. And while, Yeshiva University has two tracks. They have the Yeshiva program where you sit and learn Talmud all day. And you have IBC, which is where you really study a lot more Tanakh and a lot more critical thinking about texts all the way through. And it's sort of more of a rounded experience. And, to take a class at Yeshiva University called Biblical Archaeology, it was already sort of a little bit of a kind of an edgy thing to do, because the first class, we just walked out just completely stunned that so many of the things that we thought we knew from our traditional Jewish education really could be completely elucidated. Admittedly, our traditional commentators didn't have a lot of this archaeology, didn't have a lot of this background when they were
Yeah.
writing their commentaries. In terms of moral stories and teachings and what you can learn from something, it's great. But a lot of the time, they didn't have the raw material to really understand what the text was saying.
Hmm.
And from then
That,
on, I've sort of been hooked.
that's really interesting because I imagine that learning biblical archaeology abroad,
Mhm.
outside of Israel,
Yeah,
is very different than learning it
for sure.
here. So that's
For
very cool
sure.
that you learned it while you
And
were in New
even
York.
even when you're learning regular text, just regular Tanakh, when you're learning Navi, you're learning the stories of Samuel, David, all through elementary school, high school, they mention a city. You don't know where the city is. You don't know where it lines up. When you talk about David and Goliath, you know, there's no sense of it happens to be historically. If you study, Egyptian inscriptions, and we know that the Philistines essentially came into Egypt about the time that we were leaving.
Hmm.
The Jews had their trip through the desert. We came in from the east side into the mountains of Judea, and we were the mountain people. We stayed up there. The Philistines, the sea people, stayed on the coast.
Hmm.
And it was about the same time. But you don't get that perspective. You hear that there's Philistines. You hear that there's Jews. You hear that there's a city called Gezer. You hear that there's no sense of how these things work together, how the geography works, how the time periods work.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah,
here
it's
you
so
can,
hard to make those connections when you're so far away,
yeah, and here you can
geographically
walk
and
the walk.
obviously chronologically.
Exactly. And here you go on a tour and you say, hey, this is where this happened and that's where that happened. You know, there's archaeology to build it up, and the layers and the carbon dating and the destruction, all of that, lines up beautifully. I spent a few summers. I went down to Gat, which is El Safi, which is where Goliath was from. And they've been
Oh,
digging there. Aaron Mayer has been digging there, Bar Ilan, for many, many, many years. And they've just been exploring the world of Philistines. There, again, you see these things that just bring the text to life, and you can't ignore them.
yeah.
You can't look at it. You can't look at any of these texts again without thinking about, hey, I saw that hill, or I can see in Emek Ayala, I can see where the two armies came together, and I see a valley there, and I see a river where it says David went to pick rocks from a river. He couldn't have gone very far, so there's a good chance. That stuff living here definitely does give you that edge.
So how did you get involved with biblical archaeology and the touring? Because your book is so detail oriented. Really, the way that you write is such vivid portrayals of these scenarios that took place so long ago. So when did you start to get into this?
Well, again, I've always sort of been interested in a general kind of way, but it really started with this book a little more than 20 years ago, where I was having a debate with my brother actually about cities of refuge, which is sort of at the core of the book, where we realize that there are a lot of rules and regulations in two different places in the Torah that talk about a city of refuge, who goes there, when it happens, how it happens, all the conditions around it. And curiously, we never hear from it again. We see Joshua came into the land. He said he now allocated the 6 cities that were supposed to be the Levite cities and that's it. We never hear that anybody killed someone and escaped to one. We never hear one referred to as a city of refuge. And these were fairly large central cities, Shechem, Hebron. I mean, these were 3 on this side of the Jordan, 3 on the other, but nothing in the Talmud, nothing in Roman texts, nothing in really anything actually talks about how these would have actually worked, what the logistics were. More importantly, when they would have happened, because the conditions for a city of refuge, and again, this is just in the text. I didn't even have to do a lot of exploring.
Now, which text are you referring to?
I'm talking about the Chumash. I'm talking
Okay.
about biblical in Bamidbar and Devarim,
Mm-hmm.
Numbers and Deuteronomy, depending on our listeners here, I'll just translate. There are 2 explanations that say when you come into the land and you own the land and you're in control, allocate these cities, and someone who kills someone else accidentally, and that definition is kind of general, but the classic explanation is when you're swinging an axe and the axe handle flies off and kills someone. So you weren't doing it intentionally. It states both places. You didn't hate them yesterday, meaning it wasn't intentional. There was no motive, and it was but at the same time, you're responsible for it. So you can run off to one of these cities so that the family members wouldn't come after you. The problem is that you need to have a series of, and this is Talmudic. We talk about that in a minute, because the next time we see this is 1,000 years later in the Mishnah and the Talmud. There's nothing in between. And the general understanding is that you'd have to have roads, you'd have to have signs, you'd have to have a system and a process by which people would run to these cities. And we didn't, until the time of Saul, we were not in charge of the land, right? There was a lot of battles. We were kind of going from place to place, kind of trying with Joshua. The whole book of Joshua is basically trying to take these cities and own them. Couldn't have happened before that. Later on, when the 2 kingdoms split, Judea and Israel, you didn't have a unity there. They didn't really work together very closely. They were enemies. Sometimes they fought. They also had outside armies, outside countries that were trying to invade. They were trying to push back. We didn't have a sense of networking so the only time that I found that it could have possibly happened would be during the time of David and possibly the time of Solomon, where you had this peaceful period where once they pushed the Philistines back, there was this sense of control. And then I got addicted. Then I said, okay, well, what was life during the time of David? And therein lies the challenge, or actually what was kind of lucky for me, which is that we don't have a lot for that period. Interestingly, there's no mention of King Shlomo anywhere outside of the text of Shmuel.
That's interesting.
In other words, if he was a king this broad, this big, and this is, there are academics who have a field day with this, there's a minimalist claim that just say that that David and Saul may have been, cute little tribal leaders, but they weren't. Separate discussion. But if you accept that he was as big as the text had, marrying princesses from all over the world and you would think that somebody from the outside, from Egypt or Mesopotamia, would mention him. And it's not, there isn't a mention there. Now we have circumstantial evidence. We have cities that it says that he built, Chatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo. And it says he instructed these cities to be built and he should build their gates. And we see when we go to the archaeology, they all have identical gates almost to the centimeter, as if somebody was going from place to place, building them. So I started researching all of that. And that stuff is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But what life was like during this 100 years or so, from roughly 1000 BC, which was around the time of King David, to about 900, which was about the end of the little after Shlomo, we don't have a lot about what life was like day to day. We have what we can pull out of the text, what we can pull out of the Sefer, of the book of Samuel, the book of Shmuel. But archaeologically, we have a lot more afterwards, and we have a bunch before. Right there in the middle is a soft spot. So,
Interesting. So how did you go about kind of filling in the gaps? What kind of research did you do? What was your process like?
so basically, the first thing I did was to go through the actual text and pull out everything, every tool that was used, every weapon that was used, every garment that was mentioned, every mention of of architecture or a building, anything that could be an artifact, kind of a textual artifact. I've made notes on. I made pages and pages and pages of notes, and this was actually before the internet was really what it is today. Certainly before you know AI. And I've got
Back
a
in ancient times,
yeah, I've got right here. I've got a shelf of just books that I actually bought. Copies of pages that I made at the library. I mean,
were there can you give us an example of like what kind of books were you relying on here?
So, for instance, I can just look over here. Yigal Yadin has a book called The Art of Warfare in Biblical Lands, it's a magnum opus. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing text that, until today, even with the new things we've discovered, hasn't really been replaced or been, here and there, obviously, there are discoveries knock it, that put a different twist on them. But a book like that is amazing. Then there are dozens of texts called things like, I have one here called Life in the Biblical Age. Some of them are more reliable than others, and I was basically looking for the common threads between them. What a shepherd's life would be like. Now, a lot of these are based on a combination. Again, they're doing their own homework on merging together biblical texts and what we know about from archaeological finds and what we just know from cultures today. When you look at Bedouin culture, you can find a lot of parallels, things that really haven't changed, that wouldn't need to change, even from
Fascinating.
a few thousand years ago until today.
And just for anyone who's not familiar with the term Bedouins, can you explain what
The
that is, who they are?
Bedouin in Israel are a tribal culture, mostly found. A lot of them found from the area from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea, but they're also cities where in the 50s and the 60s, Israel tried to bring these tribes that were really kind of landless. They would move from place to place. They're nomads, and essentially they're shepherds. It's a shepherd culture, and the problem is it's very difficult in terms of geography and settlements and politically, to settle for Israel to build the state with these troops of groups moving around and claiming land and all of that. So Israel over the years has tried to move them into cities, sometimes more successfully than others, but they still, there is a core of them that still live out on the land in shacks in very, very primitive conditions. Some of them have rights. Some of them send their kids to schools. Israel has sent water and electricity to certain areas. It's sort of a whole topic on its own. But at the end of the day, there are many of them here. There are about 250,000 of them in Israel right now, which
Really?
is a lot. They make up about 3-4% of the population.
I could actually see them
Yeah. On the way
from
down to the
my
Dead Sea, you look to
house.
the right and to the left, and they're right there.
Yeah, but what's funny is that the homes look like they're in very primitive condition, but some of them have some satellite dishes on their roofs.
Yes, yes, they do. They do. They take the things that they really, really need. I'm sure they all have cell phones. But at the same time, the men take the sheep, they go out during the season and they'll disappear for a week or two and they'll go to where the water source is. And then they move to the next water source. There's a whole culture there where they have a cycle throughout the year to make sure they haven't used up all of the grass. They're towards the northern, sort of the edge of where the desert starts. So they don't have a lot of grass and weeds for the animals to eat. So they have to keep moving from place to place. They don't use it up. There's a whole system to it.
So
Many of them are living
are
very
you saying
similar
that the
lives to
way
the way they did.
that we see them now, more or less, is similar to the way that
Yeah, there's a
the
lot.
ancient tribes and the ancient Israelites were
Yeah,
living?
yeah, there's a lot that we can learn from them. A shepherd culture, you can also find that in a lot of Africa. People that are living in essentially very, very around the world. There are many cultures that are still living essentially what we would call sort of almost a biblical lifestyle, where they don't incorporate technology, they don't incorporate modern science. There's in the Amazon, there are tribes that we purposely don't interact with because we don't want to touch or introduce anything from the outside. So on the other hand, you can still learn a lot from these cultures, and you can see the way they deal with medicinal herbs, the way they deal with, finding water, preserving water. A lot of this has been lost to us because we don't need it anymore. But, so
So how did
studying
you
some of those.
incorporate this into your narrative? Because it seems like you kind of need to step into a whole different reality there.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the interesting things is that I found that once I realized how different a lifestyle it was, for instance, coins. Coins only show up in the Persian era, which is about 400 BC, which we're talking 600 years later. So in my early drafts, I mentioned people exchanging coins. And as I'm reading through some of these texts, and it talks about how silver was usually it was ingots or it was shapes or it was rings. And again, today when I was taking my tour guide course, as you go to the biblical museums or the Israel Museum or you see silver rings, and any tour guide worth his salt will explain this is the way that that money was measured at the time. So you have to start being sensitive to virtually, every food, every object. I found myself saying, am I sure that that object was there? I missed one, to tell you the truth. Somebody spotted it in a very late edit. And then I mentioned that there was a camel caravan moving out in the background. There were no camels. We have no camel. There are
Interesting.
archaeologists or archaeological experts who all they do is they go from place to place in Israel to archaeological digs, and they study animal bones. And they will tell you what animals, they'll tell you if there are a lot of pig bones, it was a Philistine site. If they notice there were zero pig bones, it was probably a Jewish site when they're trying to differentiate during that time period who was there. And that's all they do. And I met one of them when I was at one of these archaeological digs, and it just blew my mind. I was like, this
Yeah.
is all you do all day? And they said, yeah, it's fascinating because one bone in one site can open up an entire explanation of what was there. Down in the Negev, there are these very primitive sites that were along the border that we don't really understand what they were for. And through a lot of this exploration and looking at the bones and what animals were eating that made the bones more dense or less dense, whatever it is, you can figure out that it was more like an Airbnb, and that it was people went through seasonally as opposed to living there permanently as a defensive. Like, you can get those lessons from that. So this whole notion of camels, these experts will tell you we have no camel bones until around about 100 years later, the end again, around the time that the kingdom split, the end of Solomon's
Fascinating.
era and the beginning of Rehoboam's era. And as a result, that brings up challenging questions, because we have in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, we've got camels.
That's right.
Now, for that matter, we also have Philistines. And
Uh,
remember, the Philistines didn't show up for another 600 or 700 years. The challenge is how we explain those things. And again, that's not my responsibility in the book. As a tour guide, I have to. We have to explain that, possibly when we talk about Philistines later on, we didn't mean those sea people, but we mean the lands that would later be referred to as the Philistine lands.
mhm.
There are ways that you can explain, some of these things. Camels, that's a tough one. But anyway,
Fascinating.
but you're right. I found myself double checking and triple checking the most benign sentences, because you realize that someone who knows the stuff reading this is going to spot them, and it's going to ruin the whole experience for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the way cities were built, I basically, in the book, I create a city of refuge in Shechem, in Nablus today. And there's stuff going on there. There's a functioning city and people are doing things. So I had to basically rely on the archaeological findings and the academic studies, and some of it's very dry, but you have to read it if you're going to do this for real. And then I also looked for, hopefully, within biblical texts to find the elements that aligned well. I have in the beginning of the book, I have someone throwing what I call a shepherd's arrow, which, and I mention it in the book just as a kind of an explanation. But in the text, David's son Absalom is killed. He gets his hair stuck in thorns, and someone throws these things. They're translated usually as darts,
Hmm.
but we don't really know what they are. It's only time it's really used in the text. And, I use that fuzziness in the text to apply it and to say, well, this is actually what it was talking about.
Hmm.
That's, I think, for biblical historical fiction in particular, that's kind of our job, is to fill in the gaps, not necessarily to tell what happened and how, but to take the pieces that people may not be familiar with, may not have studied, and may not understand, and that the text itself isn't really clear on. And just
Yes.
say, this is one way it could have happened.
Yes. That's very interesting. So I'm curious to explore that with you, because for people who enjoy history and love to read, the genre of historical fiction is fascinating. And there are so many questions about how much can you rely on historical fiction as a veritable source, and where do you draw the line? So I'm curious to hear from your perspective as the writer
Hmm.
and the researcher and the
Hmm.
expert here. How did you're talking about filling in the gaps. So can you talk a little bit about that genre, why you chose to write a novel?
For about 20 years, I've really only read historical fiction. I'm in awe of an author who can sit down and say, not only am I going to create characters and a backdrop, and I'm going to create a story and a plot line that makes sense and doesn't leave any, you know, open-ended issues, and that really kind of feels satisfying at the end and isn't cliche and isn't, then to say, on top of that, I'm going to create a layer of historical texture that's got to, I've always just, it's blown my mind. And so as a result, I've read hundreds, of books that basically do this. And what's fascinating is that when I got to the Israel tour guide course I started, for instance, we started learning about Crusaders. I knew almost everything that they were talking about. We'd sit down at a Crusader castle and he'd talk about the architecture. He'd talk about when they came in, what weapons they were using, what their priorities were. And I had already read that in a dozen books. Now, they were all obviously fiction and they all took a particular snapshot of time. But the homework that you do as an author provides so much useful material that a reader can hopefully rely on and really believe in, that you do get enough overlap between the various stories that you can paint a fairly good picture. Again, if the authors are responsible, of what happened where. One thing I don't like in historical fiction is when you take a character who we think as benign or we think as heroic, whatever, and you paint a kind of nasty backdrop to who he was. But in particular, when you're talking about the Bible, you're talking about the Chumash, the earlier you go, the less detailed it is and the less confirmable it is. The books of Kings, Melachim Bet, we have third-party Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Aramean texts that say, I fought this battle, I did this thing. The most famous, I think, the easiest to lay out is Lachish, the city in the foothills of Judea, in the Shvela. There is Sancherib, when he came and kind of went to wipe out and went to take over and attack the area of Judea, and he took everything but Jerusalem. He went back to Babylon and made a throne room where he has this narrated picture of what Lachish looked like and how he built the ramp and how they fought. And in the text, he said, I fought and King Hezekiah, Kiyahu, I caged him like a bird in Jerusalem. What he didn't say is that, and then I had to run away and leave because I couldn't take over the city.
Yeah.
But you have these texts that are backed up by fact, and we know that they happen. Would it be interesting to take a person in Lachish and say, how did he experience that battle? For sure. And it would be a great story, and you'd have a lot to work with. As you go further back, from Kings 1 back to Samuel, you get less and less archaeological and historical information to rely on, and especially for the Chumash. When you talk about the 5 books of Moses, there's a lot there that's very bare bones.
Sure.
Very light. We don't know where many of the sites mentioned there are.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the time periods are there, and obviously secular academics who don't believe in the religious construct of it or the divine source, have a field day with saying it's a nice fairy tale.
Yeah.
And so for us to come in and try to put some logic into it, it's hard to do that for the Red Tent, which is a very, very, very well-known.
That's what I'm thinking
Anita
about.
Diamant.
Yeah.
She did it beautifully. Now it reads very authentically. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing book. It's one of the few books I actually read twice. I don't read books twice because I know how it ends and I know that there's so many other books out there. And she did a stunning job of painting a real portrait of what life would have been like.
Mm-hmm.
But not many people have the courage to do that.
Yeah.
Because
It's interesting you're saying that. I'm actually, as you're describing it, it sounds to me kind of like, maybe I'm wrong here, but Midrash.
mm-hmm.
Midrash throughout history, these are kind of like stories that may or may not have taken place, but they kind of like filling in the color and filling in the gaps, of the biblical narrative. So it seems like it's kind of like
That's
in our
exactly.
tradition to
Yeah.
do.
That's exactly what it is. And it's, this is essentially a long, detailed, entertaining, interesting Midrash. When you think about what biblical fiction is that it really does add that extra layer.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, and I'll do a quick shout out to one of the other authors you work with, who I just wrote a review with, but I actually have her book right here. Yeah, Leibowitz. Her book on Ezra and Nehemiah doesn't need a lot of Midrash. In other words, it's a good example of when you don't need to write fiction about it necessarily in order to kind of solve it all and put it together. Because we know more or less, again, from Babylonian texts, we know from the text here makes a lot of sense. what happened, why they did what they did, what the sociological issues were, what the historical issues are. So, yes, again, creating a story where you put a character into it and say, how would I have experienced it? Would definitely enlighten, would definitely add color to it, but it's not as critical. I think that when I read the Roman, a lot of Roman Second Temple time historical fiction, we know so much about how things were existed there. It's great to add it to create a character in that time period. And my next novel takes place during that time period. So it's intimidating because there is a lot Roman history we know so much about. You really have to stay in lines.
Hmm.
But it's different because you don't feel like you're trying to explain how some mysterious component may have worked. And I think that's what fascinates me much more. You can take any period and write a story that happens there. Again, that's hard, but still, what I enjoyed about this novel is that it took something, Cities of Refuge, which is a big fuzzy mystery, and it kind of created how it may have been. And at
Yeah,
the end of the day, Midrash, again, the Talmud talks a lot about cities of refuge and what would have happened and how they would have worked and what the rules and regulations were. They were talking 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years after, and it's unclear where they were basing that information from because they never reference an actual event.
that's
They're
very
simply giving
interesting.
you the legal structure. In a way, you know, they're filling in almost sort of without a storyline. They're filling in the midrash of the law.
Hmm.
But your
That's
parallel is
fascinating.
100% right.
So let's jump into your book a
Yeah.
little bit more. And I'm curious if you could, you talked about some of the characters, and can you tell us who are the characters in your book, and how would you describe them?
Okay. Um, so I have one of the things that's important to remember is that most of the people at the time, it was a time of massive, massive change in terms of religion. We were going from essentially from 5 books of Moses, from a very, again, bare bones general text where many rules today that we have entire texts written, the Talmudic texts written are coming from one sentence in the Torah. Um, Also, people were not literate. So aside from perhaps the scribes, your average for 99.9% of the population was learning and transmitting verbally, which meant that there was a lot of, you couldn't go reference a book if you were living in a little town somewhere and say, oh, how do I deal with making an oven? There's a real question. And the way that I spin a lot of the text is that they were not really obsessed with day to day religious activity. There were broad strokes about worshiping God, but it didn't affect a lot of the day-to-day activities that we think of in terms of rabbinic Judaism. And, I realized part of the way through that I hadn't even addressed Shabbat, whereas I don't have people stopping for Shabbat at any point in the story, because that would have started opening up a lot of questions. How did they observe Shabbat? Did they simply just not work in the field? Did they have any additional, ceremonial processes? I have one point where they shoot birds and hunt birds for eating. And I mentioned that while the text, I call it the teaching, by the way, in the book, which is literally what Torah means in Hebrew, as opposed to calling it the law or any other term that we use in a more modern sense, and that these general teachings would have kind of rippled through. So, for instance, we have two of the characters are a priest and his daughter, a widowed priest and his daughter. He has an altar outside in his courtyard. This was a time when centralized worship, there wasn't yet a Beit HaMikdash. People would worship God usually from an altar like all of the other cultures did. And again, archaeologically, we're finding that. We know there were times that the altars are being critiqued. And when there was a centralized place, the prophets would say, wait a minute, why are you doing it all in these? But in this time period, it was much more localized. So if he has an altar there, running away to a city of refuge was a much more structured way to do it, because in all other cultures, they would run to an altar. So we have these two trying to figure out what it's like to be living on their own, away from a city. He wasn't filling a specific role, but people would come to him, for teaching and for guidance and things like that, but not in the traditional manner that you would think. I have a Philistine, and the Philistine is basically kind of come to grips with the fact that David has pushed his people back. He's kind of fled his people, and he's a kind of a renegade, and he's realizing that the golden era of their time period is over. Historically, we know that it went on for another 300 or 400 years, but he doesn't know that. He's just kind of experiencing. One of the things as a tour guide we've learned is that you cannot judge people's decisions or movements or mindsets based on what we know afterwards. At the time, everything was precarious. Everything was scary. Everything was dynamic and changing. You cut yourself, without medication and you could be dead. Life expectancy was, in the 30s, early 40s. So he doesn't really know what's going on. He's grappling with it and trying to find his place. And I have the Levites in the town itself, in Shechem, and they are running the town, but trying to figure out, like me, how this place is supposed to work. Who do we let in? Who do we not? Do we let anybody walk in the town and just tell them, don't worry, this is a city of refuge, it's protected? If someone's a passionate blood killer, they may not be listening to that. And that's, that plays out. And then I also have David's Jerusalem, very, very, very early Jerusalem as it was being built. I danced kind of carefully around some of the archaeological finds that we see today in the city of David, because there are a lot of question marks there. So I try to keep it within those lines. But I have, again, some corruption going on there. I have some feminism, very gentle.
How does
One
that
of the
play out?
one of my pet peeves, and it's just grown on me over the years, is that historical fiction, more often than not, is probably 80% written by women. And of those texts, 80+% are about an empowered woman who who doesn't accept her role in society and pushes through to become, the detective, the leader, in both of the key women characters that I have, and they're actually my favorite characters in the book. They're each kind of exploring how far they can push, how independent they can be. And then I have one of these women who's a fairly wealthy woman in Jerusalem, but still not happy with her lot in life, and that plays out as well. So, I try to make a lot of the characters grow and develop. Obviously, no good story has characters that are static. And then there's also somebody in the city of refuge who's locked up in there. He's one of the birds. That's the term I use for the people in. That's why it's called the blood of birds. He's coming to grips with the fact that he's there. He's safe, but is this a life? He was a fairly powerful person before, and he's got to figure it all out. So there are a lot of different types of characters. Some of them interact, some of them never meet each other. Uh, and I try to move, obviously, from chapter to chapter. I try to dance, kind of move between them to keep things interesting.
Fascinating. This is just fascinating. I love this.
Thank you.
Really, it's so impressive. You mentioned the title
Hmm.
and The Blood of Birds. So
Yes.
tell us more about how you came up with that.
Well, what's interesting is that I still stand by the title. My initial title was Refuge, just because it just seemed obvious. But there actually are a lot of books called Refuge. One of them even relates to cities of refuge. And I wanted something a little bit more colorful and a little bit more mysterious. And in the book, I had already decided that I wanted to refer to them as birds, because they were in a cage where they could see out, and it was for their own protection. But this dualism, people who keep birds as pets, and I wanted to play that out. And admittedly, it's a thriller. There's plenty of, action and violence. I'll
And
talk about it in a
gore.
second. And I just wanted to get that in there. So I came up with it early on, and I kind of stuck with it. One challenge was that, the book cover, where the initial book cover was a kind of an old stone wall with a bloody feather on it. It was a feather kind of dripping in blood, or dipped in blood. And at a live event that I went to, where I was selling the book at a table, when people came by, a number of them said, "Oh, they picked it up and they'd say, oh, I don't like violent books. I don't like horror novels."
Hmm.
And I'd have to explain to them. And thank God, when I was face to face, I had the chance to explain. I'd say, there are two violent scenes in the entire book. There are action scenes there, but in terms of like serious blood being spilled, there are two of them. They're relatively short. That's not what this book is about. And it struck me, it dawned on me after a while that I may have made a mistake in at least the visual. I designed the cover myself. I do design and typography, so I also did the typography of the book. And I realized I may have overstepped in terms of the slightly aggressive cover. And when I started looking at other historical novels in general, both in this time period and others, I found that there was a very, very common, standard, accepted, and expected style of book cover. And I
How would
redid
you
the cover.
describe that? That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Which is usually, again, touching on what I was saying before, it's usually the back of a woman walking away towards a castle, towards a wave, towards a city, towards, a crowd. I don't know exactly why that's so appealing, because you're looking at the back of a woman. You're not seeing her face, so it could be anyone, but it's usually about a particular character. Somehow that got to be the mode. I wasn't going to do that exact thing, but basically I put together a new design for the cover, which has gotten a lot more traction, actually,
Oh, that's
with the
great.
city
We'll
gates,
show
which is
it down. We'll show it on the screen.
okay. And I really didn't want to change the book title. I like the book title, and it's registered, it's on Amazon. There's an Israeli printer here, BookPod, where you can order it and get it printed. I have the ISBN numbers registered. I wasn't going to start with renaming the book, and I'm not sure I wanted to. But the cover itself has to communicate a particular thing for somewhere where 90, generally you're not there to explain it and to give that explanation, say, oh,
Yeah,
don't worry, it's not.
the book cover has to speak for itself because
Yeah,
it's on a bookshelf and it's
yeah,
competing with many other titles, and
yeah,
as you can see, it really
yeah,
does have a strong impact,
yeah,
on the marketability of the book.
yeah, yeah.
Can talk a little bit about the educational, I guess,
Mhm.
potential
Yeah.
here of using historical fiction in general, and in particular with your book. Do you see your book as being potentially a resource for students who are interested in learning
Very,
more about
very
the
much
ancient
so.
world and about the period of King David?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, first of all, the draft, about a year or so ago, one of my getting close to finished draft, or so I thought, I actually toned down a little bit. There were a couple of racy scenes. There were a couple of scenes that were a little bit over the top violence wise, and a couple of things that really, really challenge traditional Jewish thinking that I realized that if I wanted this to be a little bit more palatable to a more traditional audience, especially for schools and for teachers who may want to, share it with students and say, hey, read this, do a critical analysis on, what you think about how this portrays the time period. Again, I remember when I was in elementary school reading these books, reading the biblical stories, and just feeling very like they were very abstract. They were very isolated. None of them had any context of what happened before, what happened after. On this tour guide course, one of the first things that they encourage you to buy is here, I've gotten it here, is this card that shows you all the different time periods. And on any tour, when you're saying, this is a building that was built in this time period after the Persian period, before the Hasmonean period, we know about the Hashmonaim on Hanukkah, they saved the day and they fought the Greeks back. But then they were kings for 100 years and they ran the country and expanded it and took it over. And they actually even did conversion. There's a massive story there. We don't learn that in traditional Jewish education. And if I can create a non-threatening storyline, which does not directly contradict anything that we see in biblical text, but yet adds some layer of understanding in a real world kind of way, I think it might take people who say, I'm never going to pick up Samuel 2 and just read it for fun. It's something little snippets of perhaps, or you may have come across. You're not going to dive into it and feel like I'm now understanding what this time period is.
Mhm.
So what I try to do through the book without being too professorial and being too academic and too this is the I would try to put the background into dialogue or explain at one point they're sitting around a campfire in Shiloh and one of the characters is explaining to the Phoenicians who had come down to help build the temple for David what was special about the city. And it goes on for a page or two, but he tells a story and it puts it in context and it explains why it's interesting to those people and to him and to the people who may walk through there next. So yeah, I'm really hoping that schools, that educators, parents, will find a way that they can help their kids learn about a biblical era and principles that were relevant to that time and that are relevant, even till today and understand a little bit more instead of kind of just swallowing the sort of standard generic, let's read through some chapters of of prophets and, go on to the next topic.
Yeah, as you're describing it, um, it sounds like a book like yours would be extremely helpful for any kind of educational group or camp groups
Hmm.
or even like theater,
Hmm.
theatrical skits or something like
Sure.
that. So I would think that Tanakh teachers or Hebrew school teachers, they could definitely use parts of these.
Which, again, if it's filling in the blanks, I think it's worth the time. And if it's educational, I think it's worth the time. And if you can wrap it in a mystery or a thriller, this is a little bit more of a thriller. That one's going to be a little bit more of a mystery. I think it's worth something that has some appeal. And thank God the feedback so far has been great.
Wonderful.
And it's really encouraging. And I'm looking forward to
It's
sinking my teeth
wonderful.
into.
It's a huge, huge accomplishment, and it's a
Thank you.
really interesting mix that you've been able to take your interest in Tanakh and your life in Israel and, your expertise in being a tour guide and then applying it as a creative writer.
Yeah.
So
Thank
that's
you.
that's fantastic.
Thank you.
So my last question to you
Yeah.
as we wrap up,
Yeah.
is for any aspiring authors out there. If you have any tips or suggestions in terms of bringing their work to life,
Yeah.
is there a particular place that you would sit and write, or a particular time of day? Like what kind of advice would you give to
Yeah.
aspiring
First of all,
authors?
the particular time of day, and it's one of these themes that I've seen with a lot of writers, and a lot of people talked about this. And I didn't, I had a full time job. I still have a full time job. I've been working this. I've never been able to take off, months or years to, which is why, it took a while to work through. On the other hand, as I've decided February 1st, I've got the basic plot written out of the next story, but as of February 1st, I'm dedicating every morning from about 9 to 12. And even if it means I've got to work later at night on my day job, but yeah, it's so easy to say, you know what, I've got something else to do. I've got to deal with this or that. I'll write 4 hours tomorrow. It's not, that's hard. That's very, very hard to do. So the discipline of sitting down for a set number of hours and taking a day off, say I'm going to write, Sunday, Monday, Tuesdays I'll take off, Wednesdays and Thursdays I'm going to sit down and do again, you know, but I have to tell you, if you're passionate about your story, if you throw yourself into your characters, it's a pleasure to sit down and do. It's not work. It's not toil. It's every time you get to the end and say, okay, I'm going back to the beginning now and I'm going to work through it again and do a re-edit and and do some more research and fill in gaps and whatever. It's adrenaline and it's exciting. And sometimes it's hard to put it down, but you need the discipline. You need the structure. You need, if you have a family, you can't work at the dining room table. You need to give, I've always had a home office so I can close the door and sit here and I can work. If you don't have that, then you've got to find a space, and a coffee shop gets very expensive. So probably that's not the ideal, and there's noise around you, but you've got to find a nook, find a friend who's got, an extra room who doesn't mind if you kind of like squirrel yourself away there. A library works, but you've got to find a place and a time and just do it in a very structured way, in the same way that you have to structure your story. Some people are much more able to just kind of go with it and just add a character here and then flip. Generally, though, most writers do a lot of outlining and a lot of structural work to make sure that all the different things come together. The order of the chapters makes sense if you're jumping between characters, if you're putting cliffhangers in that you don't wait too long. So you've got to do all of that in a structured way, unless you're built, in a very, very, very crazy, chaotic way. And the other thing in terms of getting it out there is, again, this is your topic much more than mine, but I went the self-publishing way because I happen to have had good people that I could rely on as editors. Again, I'm a designer, so I design the cover. I'm a typographer, so I design the inside as well. So I didn't have to rely on that. And also my company, I have a marketing company. So I do promotional videos. I do social media material. Um, I create a lot of the creatives that if I were to go to a publisher, basically what you're giving them the money for is to do a lot of all that stuff, to give you an editor, to give you a designer. Now, the one thing that they offer that I can't really do is the Rolodex, is the connections, is getting the book out there, public. And that you need either to rely on a publisher who's going to do all the heavy lifting for you, to do it on your own, which is hard. I mean, I thought I was going to be able to do this really easily. The minute it kind of got out there, it would bubble out, and that every day I'd have exponential numbers of Amazon orders coming in. Not the case. Or we find, and this is not a paid promotion here, but you find a consultant, someone who knows the ropes and knows what they're doing, and at a level that makes sense to you, can get involved and have you push it along. You need to know where you are on that. And in the event that you're going with a regular generic publisher, you also have to be ready not to make any money on the first book. I think, again, you can disagree with me here or not, but I think my mindset, I've learned now over the last 3 months, if I don't make a penny on this, if I just break even or even lose a little bit, I'm learning so much about how people respond. The book cover thing was an experiment, and I didn't think of it at the time, but it turned. You have to just be ready to put some money into, you're giving out free, if you're publishing self-publishing, you're giving out free books to everybody, and that there's a cost. And you have to be ready to use this as a learning experience and kind of get your name out there, and also to have something where you can go with the next book, whether it's to a regular publisher or whether it's to book groups or book clubs, and say, hey, this is my second book. I've got a text. I've got some, I'm proven myself already. And just look at the first one as proving yourself, establishing yourself as a writer, being able to put that on your business card, and getting enough of a following that the follow-up is going to be a little bit easier. And that's if somebody would have told me that a long time ago, I would have spent a lot less anxiety-stricken days and nights over the last couple months wondering why everything wasn't just flying on its own. But I
Yeah,
feel a lot of
it's very interesting. It's very helpful perspective that you're giving here. And I think what's also interesting is that what you're describing shows that there really can be a long life cycle and a long shelf life to any kind of book
Mhm.
because, like similar to what you're saying, in your case, you're already working on your next book, which is incredible. And so when the next book comes out, it'll also be an opportunity to market again the first book that you
Right,
did.
right. Right. And as exciting it is to have your first book, somehow I think that, you can call yourself an author when you have your first book, technically. But when you have a second one, you can say, you're an author of books. There's
Yeah.
something, there's something about it. And to show your scope and to show, what you're capable of. It's very exciting to me. And
It is very exciting. And Jay, this was such a fascinating conversation. I just want to
sure.
thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining me here in this space and talking with me and with our viewers about your book and about
Thank
your
you so much.
process.
On my website as well, I have a page where I put together recently a list of different topics and discussions and things. If somebody has a book club and would like to do, a Zoom call with a group of people who have read it and to talk about some of the issues that they come across in the book and stuff like that, I'd be delighted to. These conversations are fascinating because it's sort of a unique niche and
Definitely. And I just want to say, congratulations, Mazel
thank
tov. This is really, it's huge. It's a tremendous accomplishment to publish a book.
thank
And it
you.
just sounds like you managed to mix in so many different angles here in such a fascinating way. And I could feel that your excitement and your passion is palpable.
Yeah.
I encourage everyone to check out Jay Bailey's book, The Blood of Birds. It's available on Amazon. And thank you.
Thank you.